Thank you very much, Richard, for your kind invitation and your kind introduction. I will talk about the analysis of pre-modern student manuscript codices, as it is an important research field at this symposium session among many other events and enterprises shows. In my dissertation, I used this form of material text culture to trace the reception of the intellectual movement of Renaissance humanism at the University of Ingolstadt in the end of the 15th century. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the geography of Germany, I marked in this map of medieval universities in Europe, Ingolstadt. It is in the southeast of the Roman Empire and quite in the middle of today's Bavaria. This paper concentrates on a specific aspect of this project, i.e. on the manuscripts of late medieval students that were written or used in Ingolstadt. And they used it to store, retrieve, or transport knowledge taught and learned at the university. In this case study, I will present some ideas how these notes in the student manuscripts can be analyzed and discuss the relation of their form and their content and the content of the student manuscripts. But I will begin with some general remarks. This very famous 14th century depiction of a lecture on Aristotle's ethic held by Heinricus de Alemannia in Bologna gives us valuable insights into the ongoing of the medieval lecture hall. While most students in the first two rows here have copies of the text read by the magister, in the third and the fourth row, only one student has a codex available before him. Another student in the third row is writing down while probably the text of the book during the lecture, while the remaining students in the back rows just listen, talk, or even sleep like the one here. This depiction illustrates a central problem of late medieval university courses. Copies of the text read during the lectures were very expensive, and only students from an affluent and economic powerful social background were able to actually buy them. In this miniature, therefore, the rows of the lecture hall represent the social and economic stratification of the student body. The rich of higher social status were seated in the front, the others behind them in the back rows of the lecture hall. Nonetheless, the possession of a text copy was important for all the students, as the knowledge taught and explained during the lecture was easier to understand when the text was at hand before them. Furthermore, the copy enabled the owner to add notes to the main text and thus securing the explanations given by the master during the lecture. Getting a copy of the book lectured during a course was therefore important for all medieval university students. During the 14th and the 15th century, several options for actually getting the relevant textbooks existed. As university and faculty libraries were not open to students, but the access was exclusive for the teaching staff, they were not the place to get a hold of the books. While in Italy, the Petia system reduced the costs of buying because professional scribes copied the books rather fast section-wise, in the empire north of the Alps, such professionalization in book production was unknown. At the universities in the empire, other strategies were used during the 15th century, before the emergence and the success of printing provided enough cheap copies of texts. One of these strategies is already depicted in the picture of Heinricus' lecture. At the far end of the second row here, two students share a codex while listening to the master's explanation. This was a common practice, as regulations in university and faculty statutes from the empire show. The arts faculty in Ingolstadt, for example, decreed in summer 1476 that not more than 3 students should use one text copy together during a lecture. At the same time, however, the Council of the Arts Faculty in Ingolstadt created a possibility for the students to acquire the text commented in the lectures. The faculty paid 2 masters who dictated the textbooks used in the following semesters before the lectures actually started. Thus, the students could write down the text beforehand and then use them during or after the lectures. In the second half of the 15th century, paper was available as a relatively inexpensive writing support. Therefore, this was a rather affordable, yet quite work-intensive way to get copies of the text read in the lectures. But now we turn to the Ingolstadt student manuscripts. The Elegantiolae, written by the Italian humanist Augustinus Datus, offer an introduction to classical Latin grammar and style. The work was a very popular textbook in rhetoric classes at universities in the Holy Roman Empire during the second half of the 15th century. This book, originally written for the use in schools in Italy, explains the subject of rhetoric on a very basic level and offers a wide range of illustrative examples in Latin. Therefore, I saw in the numbers of copies written for and used in Ingolstadt rhetoric lectures an indicator of rising master and student interest in the ideas of Renaissance humanism. I was able to identify 20 manuscript copies of the Elegantiolae that were either written or used by Ingolstadt students from the late 1470s to the 1490s. These manuscripts allow us to assess the extent of intellectual changes in learning at the university, as they show us which books were actually copied by the students and used and deemed as worth preserving. A codex held today at the Staats- und Stadtbibliothek Augsburg shows which ways these manuscripts could take. Konrad Hess copied the text of the Elegantiolae in this codex here in the 1470s while studying at the arts faculty in Vienna. A short entry at the beginning of his codex tells us about the name of the scribe and his location. In 1481, Konrad Hess left Vienna and continued his studies at the University of Ingolstadt. Apparently, the copy of the Elegantiolae was no longer of use to him there, and he sold it to Johannes Stedmeister, another Ingolstadt student. The manuscript contains glosses written by 2 hands, one belonging to Konrad Hess, the other one to Johannes Stedmeister, who repeatedly refers to himself in his glosses. As we learn from official university documents, for example, from the documentation of the bachelor exam in 1479, Johannes Stedmeister ranked at the very end of the university's hierarchy. You see him here, the last one who was promoted to bachelor at this bachelor promotion in 1479. That was not an expression of his poor academic achievement, but of his limited social and economic possibilities within the personal network of the late medieval university. Under such circumstances, a used textbook copy bought from another student is not a surprise, but illustrates how students found ways to get to the relevant textbooks. The manuscript of the Elegantiolae itself allows us to get some idea on what happened in the late medieval lectures. The layout of the textbook is representative for late medieval university manuscripts. In the student copies, the main text of the Elegantiolae here is written in bigger script. Additionally, there is room for notes between the lines and at the margins of the pages. Glosses inserted between the lines mainly explain the meaning of single words, give synonyms, and name grammatical phenomena. They were probably dictated by the master and written down by the students during the lectures. The student Johannes Gramuk, for example, wrote in an interlinear gloss above the name of the classical Roman author Terentius, in rather poor Latin, the short information, "It is poeta," that is a poet. A similar and other students named Leonard Esterman wrote in his codex above Cicero the clarification, "Ille poeta," he is a poet. This section of the Elegantiolae, copied and annotated by an anonymous Ingolstadt student who later became a monk in the Regensburg monastery St. Emmeran, explains the correct use of the Latin particulates multo and longe with the comparative of adjectives. The textbook section reads in the main text on comparatives. Multo and longe are usually put before comparatives. For example, justice is much more magnificent than the other virtues. Socrates is far wiser than the other philosophers. Between the lines, the grammatical explanation hoc adverbum, this is an adverb, is given above the words multo and longe. The synonym balde is noted above multo. The name Socrates, mentioned in the main text, apparently required the explanation ille philosophus, he is a philosopher. Above virtutibus with above virtutibus with temperantia and modestia, some other virtues are named. These notes are rather short, comprise often only one or two words, and they represent basic explanation of the Latin text given by the master. These explanations help the students to understand the actual meaning of the textbook and provided more information for them. This was very basic language education given in Ingolstadt rhetoric lectures. As the medieval university had hardly any entry requirements, basic knowledge and skills had to be taught in these courses, which stood at the very beginning of the study program at the arts faculty. The glosses at the margins of the manuscript pages, however, show more intellectual engagement with and a deeper understanding of the main text. They contain no grammatical or lexical explanations, but more examples for the correct use of the grammatical and stylistic rules of the main text are given here. The anonymous glossator of the St. Emmeran Codex at first wrote down a very simple example in his marginal gloss. Johannes longe doctior es Petro. Johannes is far more learned than Peter. Then more elaborate examples follow. Vinum multo preclarius est cervisia, wine is much more magnificent than beer, and studium Ingolstadtense est multo vigorosius lepsense. The University of Ingolstadt is far more powerful than the University of Leipzig. With alcoholic beverages and inter-university rivalry, examples from the students' and masters' daily life were used as a didactic concept in foreign language teaching here in medieval Ingolstadt. In his copy of the Elegantiolae, Johannes Stedmeister, which I mentioned before, added in a marginal gloss next to the same section, Johannes Stedmeister is far more popular with the girls than the other bachelors. It seems rather unlikely that the master had dictated this particular example for the stylistic rule. Apparently, Johannes completely understood the matter taught and was able to actively formulate a Latin sentence that referred to his everyday life. The correct use of the ablative of comparison is a distinct feature of this clause. In medieval Latin, a construction with the particulate quam would have been common practice. And the scribe of the St. Emmeran manuscript actually notes this clarification in his interlinear gloss of this section of the Elegantiolae, because he writes here, Socrates longus appliatio est quam alii philosophi. I summarized the relations of format and content in the student manuscripts. There are three different parts recognizable in the manuscript pages. They differ in size of the script and in positioning. The original text of the Elegantiolae is written in bigger script and takes most of the page. The importance of the main text is highlighted by this layout. It stands at the very center and in the foreground of the manuscript pages. This is typical for student manuscripts, as the reading of authoritative texts was the very core of university lectures. Thus, this text written by an esteemed author was more important than the master's explanation and the student's notes. That relation is represented in the layout. The glosses between the lines are written in smaller script, mainly comprise short lexical or grammatical information and rarely longer explanation or even sentences. Their content basically helps to understand the main text. In my opinion, they are mnemonic devices noted by the students during the lecture to understand the textbook at later readings. Their specific purpose did not require elaborate explanation, but noting down a single word apparently sufficed. The glosses at the page margins, however, written in similar script as the notes between the lines of the main text, consist of whole sentences. More examples for stylistic rules are given in the main text are noted down here. Although the masters probably dictated most of the examples, there was the opportunity for students to write down their own ideas during or after the lectures, and I think that was certainly the case with Johannes Spielmeister gloss. These notes illustrate, in my opinion, how late medieval university teaching related to the daily life of masters and students, and that the students were able to make use of the knowledge and skills taught in the lectures. This knowledge was stored in manuscript codices, which made it available and movable. While preparing for exams, writing text at the university, or in their later work life, the owners of the codices were able to retrieve the stored knowledge and use it in other contexts. Furthermore, the manuscripts could be sold to individuals or be given to an institution. This leads us to the question of how these codices were passed down to us. The majority of late medieval student manuscripts that are available today were held at monastery or priory libraries before. When an individual student became a member of a monastery or priory, he had to give his worldly possessions to the institution. The former Ingolstadt student Leonhard Estermann, for example, gave 21 incunabula and 15 manuscript codices to the library of the Bavarian Monastery of Tegernsee in 1491. In an institutional library, the chances of preserving such manuscripts were much higher than in any other context. Two of the codices mentioned before were passed down by the monasteries St. Ulrich in Afra in Augsburg and St. Emmeran in Regensburg. Most of the late medieval student manuscripts available today in Germany and Austria are held at state libraries because the secularization in the beginning of the 19th century, the codices of the monasteries and priory libraries were either destroyed or taken over by the emerging modern states. University libraries, in contrast, rarely possess any pre-modern student manuscripts at all. They mainly collected the codices of the medieval faculty libraries and in some instances of the teaching staff. This situation of the manuscript edition leaves us with a corpus that is certainly not representative for the entirety of text written and used at the University of Ingolstadt in the second half of the 15th century. The still existing student manuscripts, however, give us an idea on how knowledge was taught, learned, stored, and used in late medieval universities. They give us today unique insights into the medieval lecture hall. These manuscripts are an extremely valuable source, but their identification and analysis requires a lot of time, work, and skill. Thinking systematically about the relation of the content and the form of the notes in these manuscripts, in my opinion, opened up new perspective on this particular material text culture of late medieval universities. Therefore, I suggest to include this perspective in the study of pre-modern teaching and learning. And thank you very much for your attention.